Hi, I'm Mike Neglia. I'm here with Pastor David Guzik from Calvary Chapel, Santa Barbara. Just going to sit down and ask a couple questions, and our listening and watching audience can just sit in. So, how are you doing this evening?
Very well, thank you.
Great. So you've
Very happy to be here.
you've come to Cork amongst many other things to do a series of talks based on your recent book, Standing in Grace.
Right.
Can you talk to us a bit about that book, or primarily, I guess, the writing process of that book?
I actually wrote the core material for this book more than 20 years ago. As a young man, my life was just really impacted by an understanding of the New Testament doctrine of grace. And I dug into it very deeply, did a lot of research, basically examining every passage in the New Testament where it spoke of grace and understanding its context and power and depth. And I could say in some measure it was life transforming. As a very young man, I wrote a book and thought that publishers might be interested in it. They weren't. I shopped it around some publishers a second time. A few years later, they weren't interested in it then. And then kind of at the urging of some pastor friends and graciously my wife, they were like, I just go ahead and self-publish it, and that's what I've done. And I'm happy with the content of the book, as I often tell people. Sometimes I'd like to rewrite it, and I expect that someday I will, because I kind of think I'm a better writer than is reflected in the book. But I'm very happy with the content.
Okay.
It's really blessed my own life, and I think it is a message that brings blessing to the life of other people.
Okay, and about that, the content of it and the message. Right. The theme, of course, is the grace of God. How would you define God's grace?
Well, I think that the classic definition that we use, God's unmerited favor, it's sufficient if it's explained in depth enough.
Okay.
That grace belongs to God in a unique way, in that it's His, it's what He dispenses, and it's an essential part of His character. I think it's fascinating that in the New Testament, it describes the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, each individually having a special link to the grace of the triune God. And then it's unmerited, and all that means, and that it's given to the undeserving, and then especially favor. Grace is a feeling word. And this is part of the complaint I have with those who speak sometimes about the doctrines of grace. The purpose of the book or this interview isn't to debate the doctrines of grace.
Sure.
But I think that when people speak in those terms about the doctrines of grace, it sort of removes the grace of God from the warm personal favor of God. Charis, as it's used in the New Testament vocabulary, it's a very warm feeling word, and it describes how God feels about us.
Okay. So the traditional understanding of God's unmerited favor, you say it's a good definition.
It's a good starting point.
Good starting point.
I don't, I wouldn't despise it. I don't have a better three-word definition.
Yeah.
But that ancient Greek word charis had a lot of associations that really could be understood on top of that.
Okay. And that's your basic definition of grace and your understanding of grace. Could you talk for a few minutes about some common misunderstandings of grace? How have people, and how do people today misunderstand grace?
I would say the two most common misunderstandings of grace are, number one, people take grace and again they remove it from the warm heart of God. They forget that it describes God's disposition towards the believer, how He feels about them, and they think that it only describes God's power or initiative in the act of salvation. Or that.
Okay.
The other aspect to it that I think is very important, that is often forgotten, is that grace is far more than just the starting point of the Christian life. And I find that this to be a commonly held idea. Christians generally will agree to the idea that we're saved by grace. That's been drilled into people's heads pretty thoroughly. But the idea that our present standing is in grace, thus the title taken from that Romans 5:1-2 passage, that it's in grace in which we stand. I think that that's something that's commonly neglected among Christians.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Yeah.
And I want to personally grasp that more and more every day.